So this is just to provide a quick overview of some of the basic sort of features of the Greek world. And then the earliest sort of period that historians can identify civilization in terms of that sort of Neolithic age. So as I said, the dating systems, you'll come across two different ways to sort of look at these time periods. So BC AD, and then sort of more recently BCE or CE. And really, they're the same thing. They're just different ways of referring to the time period. So initially, in the Greek and Roman world, people didn't keep track of time cumulatively. If they wanted to reference a particular year, they would use sort of some references that people would recognize. So, for example, the fifth year of the Peloponnesian War, or the year after the oracle at Delphi said this. Same thing with Rome. They would reference the year by the year of an emperor's rule. So it isn't until the 6th century that a monk named Dionysius in Rome decides that he wants a more efficient dating system. And obviously this is a Christian world and he is a monk. So he uses the birth of Jesus as sort of his start date. And so AD is Latin for Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. So the year 50 would be 50 in the year of our Lord, or 50 AD. And so he then sort of goes through all of these records and tries to track back until he can get to that zero. Unfortunately, he was a little off. So we actually know that the year he thought Jesus was born was not true. It was actually about 4 BC, but we still use it. And then in the 8th century, Bede, the venerable Bede, who was a monk in England, wanted to be able to go backward. So we can account for time since the birth of Jesus, but Bede was writing a history of England and he wanted to go before the birth of Jesus. So he's the one that kind of invents the BC, which meant before Christ, sort of. More recently, scholars have tried to, in recognition of a more secular way of thinking about history, sort of remove that Christian element from our dating system. So they have moved to the abbreviations BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era. I still use BC because you can call it whatever you want. It's still predicated upon a Christian worldview, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. If you we're talking about a Jewish calendar, obviously it's much different. The year 1 in a Jewish calendar is the year that, according to their read of the Bible, the world was created. Similarly, the Muslim calendar is different, right? And so that's predicated upon the Hijrah, or the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. So I do think it's important to recognize that there is just a religious element in our dating system. Okay, that said, periodization. So these are the major periods that historians sort of identify when they think about Greece. And obviously these dates are really arbitrary, but they do give us some general parameters that are related to sort of major shifts or major changes. So the Neolithic age, which we're not going to talk very much about. Then we'll sort of jump in at the Bronze Age. So this was when we really start to see the first outlines of a civilization in this area that we associate with Greece. First, the Minoans on the island of Crete, and then the Mycenaeans on the mainland. Then things happen around 1150, and we're not quite sure what those things are, but we do know there's a big disruption in their political and economic culture. And so that ushers in this period known as the Iron Age, or the Dark Ages. Dark because during the end of the Bronze Age, they had developed a system of writing that sort of temporarily disappears. So it's dark because we just don't have many sources for it. And then as we move towards sort of 750, the 8th century, they start to sort of reemerge, and you start to see in particular these city-states, some the same as the ones that dominated the Mycenaean period, but others like Athens and Sparta, who are really sort of new on the scene. And then this is when we really start to see the outlines of the Greek culture that you're all probably a little bit more familiar with. The end of the Archaic Age is sort of marked by the Persian Wars, and then the Classical Age marked by the Peloponnesian Wars, so internal conflict within Greek society, and then the end, 323, corresponds to the death of Alexander. That's pretty much when we're going to stop. The next period is that Hellenistic age, so that's post-death of Alexander, when you have this diffusion of this Greek culture across the Mediterranean. So in terms of sources, we really do try to use whatever we can to provide information about what the Greek world looked like. Written sources are obviously really useful, and we're going to be encountering a number of those throughout the semester, but also material culture, objects, archaeological investigations are extraordinarily fruitful, and then there are also architectural sources. So just some examples of written sources as well as their limitations. So we do have literary sources, but a lot of what was written in Greece during the ancient period, we only have in later copies. So for example, this is a copy of Aristotle's Constitution of Athens. We only know about this because later Egyptians during the Hellenistic period, so around 100 CE, wrote it down. And a lot of it is written down in this papyri because sort of the intellectual hub of the Hellenistic world was Egypt. And that papyri does not survive very well. So you can kind of see the state that this is in. Similarly, we do have some papyri of Homer. This is one of the most complete. It's called the Banks Homer. It's in the British Museum. And so we do have some of these sources to varying degrees of completion, but most of them are later copies of originals because the originals themselves did not survive. There's also a lot of literary sources that we know existed at one point in time, but we do not have them. So we know they existed because a source will reference them, but they've never actually been found. More durable are these stone inscriptions, and these were a pretty common way of communicating in the Greek world. So you see these stelae, these sort of stones that are erected in public places, and then they'll have inscriptions. A lot of them are sort of commemorative, but some of them are actually more informative. And these obviously, because of their nature, if the buildings that they are inscribed upon or the stones themselves haven't been destroyed, we still have the writing. Material culture is also really, really useful for a number of reasons. And a lot of it is because it gives us this visual reference. So for example, in sort of reconstructing some of the articles you're gonna be actually looking at how scholars have used images on pottery to sort of reconstruct what a Spartan hoplite looked like. So a typical Spartan soldier. And so a lot of our knowledge of sort of dress, of mannerisms, but also things like military techniques and military culture can be traced to this type of pottery. And so you can see in the one image on the ceramic pot, you have these warriors, and then the other image you have actually a burial. And so this gives us insight into burial customs, sort of what happened at a funeral, who was there, who was present, what were people doing. So we really can mine a lot of these visual images to sort of get a better understanding of what Greek life was like. And then grave goods. In part because during particular periods, the most common form of dealing with someone who is dead is to bury them in the ground as opposed to like cremation. You can find a lot of the actual material culture that existed at the time. Usually it's more members of the elite who would have been buried with things like this. So on the bottom, this is a very famous gold filigreed cup, the Buffeo cup, that was found in conjunction with the Mycenaean period. So it gives us a lot of insight into what materials the Greeks had access to. The pottery and the other grave goods, we can sort of identify with a particular location. And so when you find it far removed from that location of origin, it also tells you a lot about sort of trade routes. Also, archaeological exploration is still going on, and they're still discovering new materials and new images all the time. So for example, this is an Heliotropa cave. So this was a cave that was very common. It was used in the earliest periods for burial. And so this cave was used from about 6000 BC. So during that Neolithic period. There was something that happened around 3000 that like maybe an earthquake. So the opening was then covered, and so it wasn't discovered until 1958, which is actually fairly recently if you think about how long it was there. And then they discovered the entrance, and then they began actual excavation in 1970. And what they found is that this was a place used by particular Neolithic tribes for burial. And so about 170 people have been discovered buried within this cave. So some of these burials actually have been sort of surprising in terms of just revealing little glimpses into Greek life. So you can see the one burial, it's kind of hard to see because of the state of the remains, but you have two skeletons. DNA investigation has revealed that one is male and one is female, and the way they buried them, they're actually embracing each other. So the one is sort of spooning the other. On the other side, also kind of difficult to make out the particulars, but this is a double pithos burial. So this was actually bones, so probably once a body, of two infants that were put in separate clay pots, and the pots were used as sort of a vessel to bury them. And so one of the things that archaeologists and forensic archaeologists have been able to determine is sort of their diet. So they've been able to determine that these people were very malnourished. A lot of the times you find traces of anemia, so associated with lack of iron. You also see in a lot of instances, particularly with adult skeletons, causes of death, evidence of violence. So if you have, for example, sword wounds sometimes show up on bones, or sort of a skull will show evidence of sort of violence or injury. So we can also get sort of insight that way. Obviously, architecture. This is one of the major sort of religious sites that's still there, and in a lot of instances the architecture also tells us a lot about their mathematical abilities. So in order to get a shape that was very aesthetically pleasing, they engaged a lot of mathematical calculations to make sure that pillars were the right height and that the structure had the right symmetry. Obviously, a lot of this architecture has bas-relief, so carvings along the top or on pedestals, and a lot of the times those carvings will relate to a particular moment in time or a festival or some sort of religious worship. You also see in a lot of the inhabited residences, these mosaics. So that's what you see here on the right. So this would have been sort of tile, different colored tile that would have been on floors or on walls. And again, it gives us this real visual clue into how people in ancient Greece dressed, how they conducted themselves, how their various features, what they would have looked like, what the interior of a residence looked like. And so we can use these again to sort of piece together this bigger picture of the Greek world. So just a quick note about topography. What are we talking about? When we use that term Greece to refer to the pre-modern period, which we're doing, we're actually being very inaccurate. The Greeks never used it. This whole idea of a place called Greece as one entity is really misleading. So that's very much sort of a modern view of Greece that's been imposed upon this past. They would have referred to all of the land you see here in that reddish pink as Hellas, because they referred to themselves as Hellenes, which was actually a reference to the language that they spoke. There are a lot of different dialects, but ultimately most people from the different city-states of this region would have been able to communicate to some degree. So they would not have identified as Greeks. They would have identified according to the city-state that they were from. So if you were from Athens, you would have identified as an Athenian. If you were from Corinth, you would have identified as a Corinthian. So you have thousands of different independent city-states across this region. And a city-state is sort of a particular formation. So subject to the same government are people within the walls of a city, as well as people in the rural areas outside the city. And as we start talking about some of these specific city-states, I'll give you some more information about that. So for the most part, they are politically independent from each other. What they share is this common language, this Hellenic language. They do have a common belief system. So they all sort of recognize the same religious entities, the same gods and goddesses, though they might take a slightly different shape or a different form depending on where you go. But they all had kind of a notion of Zeus, sort of a head god. They all had sort of a notion of an Athena, the warrior goddess, Zeus's daughter. So a lot of times they would come together for common religious festivals. And then a political culture, while it varied, they all would recognize the monarchy as a viable form of governing, oligarchy, so a handful of elite individuals making decisions, and then they did recognize democracy, though that was very specific to Athens. The other thing that sort of distinguishes them is they have this very clear notion of what divided them from everybody else, from these others who they often referred to as barbarians, because they did not share this culture, they did not share this language. So Macedonia at the north of that map is sort of the top edge. So people from Thrace, people from Illyria, and absolutely the Persians fit into that category of other. And so they very much define themselves in opposition to those who were not like them. Demography is also really important, as we'll see sort of moving forward, and is shaped a lot by the topography of Greece. So this is supposed to show sort of the hills and the mountains. So 75% of Greece, especially mainland Greece, is hilly, it's mountainous. It's very difficult terrain. It's not sort of conducive to agriculture, and there are lots of natural barriers that separate one part of the Greek world from another. So you can see here, sort of the center there, the Peloponnesus. So that's like almost an island, but not quite, because there's a little strip of land that connects it to Attica, which is part of mainland Greece. So the Peloponnesus is where Sparta is. And so you can see how there's these really natural barriers that would have separated Sparta from the rest of mainland Greece. You obviously also have the water. So a lot of these city-states are on islands. So they have this very maritime culture, but that water would have provided advantages like transport, access to food, but it also would have provided sort of a natural isolation. Most of Greece is an agricultural society. That number drops down a little bit as we move forward towards the classical period. But so at the outset of the Archaic period, about 90% of the population is engaged in agriculture. So not just sort of planting grains and legumes, but also tending to olive groves and tending to vines, so growing grapes to make wine. The average family farm was like 9 to 15 acres, which in part seems like quite a bit, but like I said, not all of that is cultivated land. A lot of it would have been vines or olive groves. And so they are able to produce these very sort of valuable commodities like olive oil. Obviously, the grapes they can turn into wine. Their diet is very much focused on these plant-based products like grains, barley, legumes that they would have used. So these are like beans. And then a very limited number of animals would have been used in consumption. So you do have sheep, you do have goats, and those are herds that are largely used for what the individuals produce. So the wool, obviously, from the sheep, the milk from the sheep, those sort of byproducts are valued. So not a very meat-centered diet. We do know to some degree, though these are all just really general estimates because the records aren't as rich as we would like them to be, the average age of death in Greek society was about mid-40s for men, a little bit younger for women. Men typically died of disease or of military conflict. For women, the greatest risk, even aside from disease, was actually complications in pregnancy and childbirth. So that's why that number is a little bit lower for women. We know that the mortality rate was very, very high. Probably about 50% of all babies who were born did not survive that first year. I think it's Aristotle that actually says there's like a 7-day window and they're either going to live or they're going to die. In spite of that, though, the average number of children per family that survived was probably hovered between 4 and 5. So these families could be large, but in part, too large was actually considered disadvantageous because it was more mouths to feed or more dowries to provide or more sons who wouldn't inherit. So it's sort of a careful balance in terms of producing enough children to sustain the family, but not too much that they drain the family's resources. The average age at marriage for men, sort of late 20s, early 30s, typically only until they were sort of established and independent and could sort of support their own households was when they would marry. So that's why they're a little bit older. For women, it was sort of mid-teens. Typically, as soon as a girl entered puberty, she was considered of marital age. This is something we'll be discussing quite a bit, are these different sort of ways to measure adulthood, different ways to think about appropriate ages in terms of sort of sex and sexuality. So obviously every society and culture has sort of a different view of what is appropriate when, and when someone is an adult and when someone is a child. So we'll look at that moving forward. This is an image that shows a wedding. So this is a woman who is preparing for her wedding day. They had very elaborate customs. You can see that she's covering her head with a veil. That was a symbol of sort of purity as she entered into this marriage. So then this really, really early period, this Neolithic period that we're not really going to talk much about, historians have been able to identify at least seasonal occupation in the Greek mainland as early as 18,000 BC. These are probably cave dwellers, so hunter-gathering societies, which would move from sort of a summer pasture to a winter pasture. So at least some of that time was spent on the Greek mainland. They had not domesticated animals yet, and they weren't practicing agriculture yet. But then as this period sort of continues, we start to see the emergence of some limited agriculture and some villages. So more permanent occupation where they're not moving from place to place following the herds, but they've been able to domesticate the animals, which allows them. Domesticating animals means that you are able to get animals to breed in captivity. And obviously, Figuring that out means that instead of you following the herds wherever they go, you can confine them and keep them where you're at. We do see evidence of trade across the Mediterranean. This is what's known as this is one of the this pot here is one of the archaeological finds that gives us evidence of this trade. So this is a demi-ceramic. This is actually associated with the island of Milos. And so the fact that this material is found in the Greek mainland and can be dated to this early period tells us that there was this movement. They've also found obsidian from the island of Milos, which was used to make into blades and arrowheads, so also indicative of some trade. Towards the end of this Neolithic period, as we move towards the Bronze Age, we do see the emergence of what seem to be some social distinctions, usually with a tribal society. Most people are sort of equal, but then as you start to become more settled, and material consumption becomes part of the culture, you start to see these separations, and particularly some sort of chieftain or leader, someone who is responsible for decision making, and eventually that sort of chieftain is going to evolve into sort of the first Mycenaean kings.